Welcome to the back room. Relax, unwind, and let our soothing gangster bedtime stories guide you into calm and peaceful sleep. Here, we tell the quieter side of history, the childhoods, ambitions, and lives of legendary gangsters, without focusing on violence. As you settle in, share with us in the comments where you're listening from, what time it is right now, and one good thing that's happened to you today. We'd love to hear from you. If you enjoy our stories, please like this video to support the channel and subscribe so you never miss a new upload. Your encouragement helps us bring more Mafia bedtime stories to life. Now close your eyes, feel at ease, and enjoy tonight's story. Wishing you peace and the sweetest dreams. The city did not sleep that night. It only pretended to. Beyond the thin veil of winter fog, New York lay in a state of muted tension, streets glistening with a film of rain, traffic lights reflecting in shallow puddles like fragments of shattered, stained glass. Somewhere in the distance, a siren rose, stretched thin by the cold air, before fading into a hum that might have been the wind. The sidewalks carried their usual weight of cigarette smoke, exhaust, and the faint, untraceable scent of roasted chestnuts from a lone vendor braving the chill in the heart of Little Italy, where the street lamps wore halos from the mist and the cobblestones seemed to remember the footsteps of 100 forgotten deals. There stood a steakhouse that was more than just a place to eat. Inside, time moved differently. The lighting was low but not dark, just enough to make the shadows feel alive, curling in the corners like eavesdropping guests. The air held a complex perfume, charred meat from the grill, a whisper of garlic butter, and the faint musk of cigars smuggled in from Havana decades earlier. Conversations did not travel far here. They folded into themselves, murmurs swallowed. By the velvet walls, it was here, at a table near the center, that John Gotti sat. His suit was a deep charcoal, the kind of fabric that drank in the light, making his shoulders look broader, his frame more solid. A silk tie, burgundy and understated, rested neatly against a pressed white shirt. His hair, immaculately combed back, caught the faint gleam of the overhead chandelier, each strand disciplined into place. His hands were still, fingers resting lightly against the stem of a crystal glass. There was no ring on his finger tonight, but the absence somehow drew more attention than the presence would have. Around him, laughter rose and fell like the swell of a tide. It was not the laughter of strangers. It was the practiced, careful, kind, shared between men who understood the balance between loyalty and survival. The kind that could be warm, but never careless. Gotti smiled occasionally, but the smile never lingered too long. Some might have called him charming. Others would have called him dangerous. Both would have been correct. He had not always been this man, the figure in a perfect suit, the epicenter of quiet attention. Once he was a boy in the rough neighborhoods of Queens, running messages for men whose names were never spoken in public. He remembered the sound of loose change in his pocket, the smell of hot asphalt in summer, the way his mother's hands stayed raw from washing clothes for other people. He remembered the way certain men walked slow, deliberate, with the confidence of someone who never had to ask for anything twice. That walk, he had learned, was as valuable as any weapon. Tonight, his own walk into the steakhouse had been unhurried, deliberate, the kind that parted crowds without a word. But unlike the men he had once admired, Gotti understood the theater of it. He knew eyes were on him, even when he pretended not to notice. The waiters here moved with a different kind of grace when serving his table. No rushed gestures, no clipped tones, just the fluid, almost ceremonial movements of people who knew they were part of something larger than a dinner service. Plates were set down without a sound. Glasses were refilled before they could empty. The air around the table seemed thicker, heavier somehow, as if invisible currents were swirling just out of sight. At a table across the room, a young man, barely in his 20s, kept glancing toward Gotti. His suit was ill-fitted, the fabric pulling at the shoulders, but his tie was perfectly knotted, as if someone else had done it for him. The young man's eyes carried that mixture of awe and hunger that Gotti had once worn himself. Gotti noticed, of course. He noticed everything, but he gave no sign. The conversation at his own table drifted easily from one topic to another. A property deal uptown, a dispute over distribution, the state of the Yankees' batting lineup. Nothing said outright, everything wrapped in layers of suggestion. It was a language of nods, pauses, and careful omissions. Gotti leaned back slightly in his chair, letting the laughter wash over him. His gaze flicked briefly toward the window, where the mist outside clung to the glass like a second curtain. Somewhere beyond that curtain, the world was changing, laws tightening, prosecutors sharpening their teeth, the newspapers waiting to pounce on the smallest hint of scandal. He knew this, though he did not speak it aloud. The steak arrived perfectly seared, a thin line of smoke still curling upward from its surface. Gotti cut into it with slow precision, as if each slice deserved its own moment. Across the table, one of his men cracked a joke about an acquaintance's failed business venture. The table laughed, but Gotti only smiled faintly, eyes lowering to his plate. It was then, in that small pause, that something unspoken passed over him, a shadow. Behind the eyes, gone as quickly as it appeared. Maybe it was memory. Maybe it was foresight. Whatever it was gone by the time he lifted his glass again, and yet, if one were paying attention, they might have seen it for what it was. The first hint of the ending, already written. A waiter passed by, setting down another bottle of wine, and for a brief moment, the sound of the cork popping seemed too loud, like a crack in the carefully constructed calm. Gotti's eyes followed the waiter until he disappeared toward the kitchen. The young man from across the room still watched him, though now he tried to disguise it with sips of water. Gotti's smile, warm on the surface, flickered with something sharper beneath. A message, silent but clear. You can watch, but you can never touch. The night wore on. Outside, the fog thickened, blurring the outlines of streetlights until they looked like distant fires. Somewhere down the block, a car engine idled for longer than it should have. Inside, the steakhouse remained a pocket of warmth and dim light, the air hazy with the sweet temps of cigar smoke. When Gotti finally rose from the table, the movement was as deliberate as his arrival. Chairs shifted back, voices quieted without instruction. He placed a few folded bills into the waiter's hand, more than the meal cost, but not enough to draw comment. His coat, a deep wool overcoat with a collar turned just so, settled over his shoulders like armor. He adjusted it with a small tug at the lapels, an unconscious gesture he had carried since his youth. The door opened, and for a heartbeat, the noise of the street, a car horn, a distant shout, seeped in before the door closed again. He stepped out into the night, the mist curling around him, street lamps casting long shadows that merged and stretched into the darkness. His steps were slow, measured. Somewhere behind him, laughter resumed, glasses clinked, and life in the steakhouse went on as though nothing had shifted. But something had, though no one could name it yet. The air that night held a faint, metallic Taste the kind that comes before a storm. The year was 1897, and Palermo was a city caught between sunlit beauty and shadows that clung like ivy to its narrow stone walls. The mornings began with the soft hum of waves brushing against the old harbour, carrying with them the salt temps of the Mediterranean. To a young boy named Salvatore Lucania, the sea was both a constant and a mystery, a glittering expanse that promised escape but never revealed to where. Palermo's streets were a patchwork of cobblestones worn smooth by centuries of footsteps. The air was always alive, the distant clang of church bells marking the hour, the sharp calls of fishmongers hawking their morning catch, the sweet smell of fresh bread mingling with the tang of olive oil and cured meats. Merchants shouted prices in Sicilian dialect, voices bouncing off buildings that seemed to lean toward one another like gossiping neighbors. It was in those labyrinthine alleyways that Salvatore learned his first unspoken lessons. Respect wasn't asked for, it was taken. The old men at the corner cafes played cards with an intensity that made the air feel heavy. Their conversations layered with pauses that meant more than the words themselves. Eye contact was currency, and silence could be as sharp as a blade. Even at 8 years old, Salvatore understood that in Palermo, survival wasn't about strength alone. It was about knowing when to speak, when to listen, and when to vanish into the crowd. His father, Antonio, worked as a stonemason, his hands calloused from years of coaxing shapes from stubborn rock. His mother, Rosalia, kept the family's small apartment neat despite its crumbling walls and peeling paint. They were good people, devout and hard-working, but in Sicily, at the turn of the century, virtue didn't always fill your stomach. The whispers of opportunity across the ocean became louder with each passing year. Tales of streets paved with gold in a place called America, though most who had been there knew the gold was more often in the dreams than the dirt. By 1906, the Lucania family made the decision. Salvatore was 9 when they boarded the ship in Naples, leaving behind the scent of lemons in the air and the familiar blue horizon of Sicily. The journey across the Atlantic was a trial in itself. They traveled in steerage, the lowest deck, where the air was thick with the mingled smells of unwashed bodies, damp wool and coal smoke drifting down from the funnels. The floor pitched and rolled beneath their feet, and the constant hum of the engines was like a heartbeat that never stopped. Days blurred together. The only light came from small portholes, and meals were ladled from giant pots into dented tin bowls. Yet even here, young Salvatore watched and learned. The cramped quarters were a society of their own, disputes over. Sleeping space, the quiet solidarity of shared bread. The way a man's tone could command respect without raising his voice. When the skyline of Manhattan finally appeared on the horizon, it was unlike anything they had imagined. The air was colder, sharper than Palermo's, and the towering shapes of buildings looked like something out of a dream. Rosalia gripped Salvatore's shoulder, her eyes wide as they passed the Statue of Liberty, its copper skin green with sea salt. For Antonio, it was a promise. For Salvatore, it was a challenge. The Lower East Side of New York in 1906 was a place of noise, motion and contradictions. Streets overflowed with pushcarts, selling everything from pickles to bootlaces. The languages of the world mingled in the air, Yiddish, Italian, Greek, English, forming a chorus that was both chaotic and comforting. Tenement buildings rose in grim, tight rows, their windows crowded with drying laundry and curious eyes peering down at the street. The Lucania family rented a single room in a brick tenement on East 10th Street. The walls were thin enough that You could hear your neighbor's cough in the middle of the night, and in summer, the heat was stifling. Yet compared to the poverty they had left behind, it was a new world. School was difficult. Salvatore sat at a desk too small for him, his knees pressed against the wood, listening to lessons in a language that felt like a puzzle missing half its pieces. He picked up English in fragments, from teachers, from other boys in the street, from store signs, but his Sicilian remained the language of home. It was outside the classroom, on the streets, that his real education began. The neighborhood kids played games that doubled as training for survival stickball in the alleys, marbles on the stoops, races that darted dangerously close to streetcar tracks. Older boys, members of small street gangs, lounged on the corners, their eyes sharp for opportunity. Some ran errands for local shopkeepers, others for men whose shops had no customers but always seemed to be open. Salvatore was quick, with an instinct for reading people. He could tell when a man was bluffing, when a threat was empty, and when silence meant danger. He learned how to move unseen through a crowd, how to pocket an apple from a cart without breaking stride. These were not the lessons his parents approved of, but in the Lower East Side, such skills were the difference between being prey and being something else entirely. There was one man in particular, a local figure named Don Michel, who caught Salvatore's attention. He was not a large man, but he carried himself with the quiet assurance of someone who was never questioned. His suit was always pressed, his hat tipped at the perfect angle, and children instinctively stepped aside when he passed. Salvatore noticed how people spoke to him, not loudly, but with respect. Money seemed to find its way to Don Michel without him ever asking, though they never exchanged words. Salvatore watched him closely, storing away the details. It wasn't about the clothes or the walk. It was about the presence, the kind of presence Palermo's card players had, the kind that made the air heavier when they entered a room. Years later, when Salvatore would be called lucky and command a presence of his own, he would remember those early lessons, the salt tang of the harbor, the silent nod of respect, the unspoken rules that crossed oceans intact. But for now, he was just a boy navigating a city that could either make you or break you. In the glow of the gaslights, with the shouts of street vendors fading into the night, Salvatore felt the pull of two worlds, the honest labor his parents valued, and the quicker, sharper path whispered by the streets. And somewhere, deep inside, a decision was already forming. Not in words, not even in full thoughts, but in the quiet certainty that he would not live his life in the shadow of another man's will. In Palermo, he had learned to read the weight of silence. In New York, he would learn to fill it. The Lower East Side in the 1910s was never still. Even in the early morning, before the sun had fully pushed its way above the brick tenement rooftops, the streets breathed with movement. Pushcarts rattled across cobblestones, their iron wheels clicking over seams in the street. Bread ovens exhaled their yeasty warmth into the cold dawn air, and somewhere nearby, the scent of roasting coffee tangled with the acrid burn of tobacco smoke. Salvatore Luciano was barely a man, not yet 20, but his stride had already learned. The rhythm of these streets, a pace neither hurried nor idle, just steady enough to suggest he belonged here. His eyes scanned without seeming to. That was something you learned quickly in these blocks. Watch everything, let no one see you. Watching it began with errands, small things, a package from a tailor to a pool hall, an envelope from a fruit stand to the back room of a cigar shop. Nothing worth the attention of the police, nothing that would trouble a priest's conscience. But the men who handed him these, Small jobs, they had a way of making you feel that you'd been tested and that you'd passed. Luciano had learned early that trust in the neighborhood wasn't given freely. You built it the way masons laid brick, one quiet act at a time. A message delivered without questions, a favor done without complaint, a promise kept without reminder. One winter evening, the snow crusted thin over the rooftops. Luciano was asked to bring a paper-wrapped parcel to a dimly lit cafe near Hester Street. Inside, the air was thick with steam and cigarette smoke. The windows were fogged, and a brass coffee pot hissed on the counter. In the back, at a table no one approached without being invited, sat two men, one Sicilian, one Irish. They spoke low, leaning toward each other as though the rest of the world had been pushed aside. It was there that Salvatore first saw Maya Lansky. Not that the name meant much to him then. Maya was just another face in the crowd, narrow-eyed with the kind of quiet confidence that didn't need to be advertised. The handshake was brief. No words were wasted. Luciano placed the parcel on the table, nodded once, and left. But later, he'd remember the way Lansky had looked at him. Not just at him, but into him, as if he were already making calculations. The Lower East Side was a web, and Luciano was learning its threads. Italians worked with Italians, the Irish stuck to their own, and the Jewish gangs kept their business tight. But there were cracks in those walls if you knew where to look. Moments when need outweighed pride, when opportunity outweighed prejudice. Luciano had an instinct for those moments. A week after that first meeting, a boy barely older than Luciano himself appeared outside the pool hall on Rivington Street. He wore a cap pulled low, hands in his coat pockets. "Maya wants to see you," was all he said. The meeting was in a cramped upstairs room above a candy store. The smell of sugar hung heavy in the air, oddly at odds with the serious faces, gathered around a scarred wooden table. They spoke of shipments, of routes, of how certain goods might arrive without the burden of certain taxes. Luciano didn't speak much, not yet, but he listened. He listened the way a man in the desert watches the horizon for clouds. It was in those dim rooms and narrow hallways that he began to understand the quiet machinery of the street. Every transaction had 3 layers: what it appeared to be, what it really was, and what it might become. One night, after a card game in a back room thick with the smell of stale beer and sweat, Lansky pulled him aside. "You see the way they play?" he asked. Luciano nodded. "They think in one hand. You gotta think in the whole deck." It wasn't just a lesson about cards. Luciano felt it even then. Lansky was different, sharper, colder in some ways, but also able to see the bigger picture. And maybe that was why, when other boys his age were still scraping for scraps of territory, Luciano was starting to think about alliances. The streets didn't change their nature just because the lamps came on, but they changed their face. Night wrapped the Lower East Side in shadow, softening the grime and hiding the frayed edges. Deals were made leaning against lampposts, in alleys that smelled of rotting produce, in the back of wagons where burlap sacks disguised other, more valuable cargo. Sometimes Luciano would walk home alone after one of these small jobs, the coins from his pay warm in his pocket. He'd pass tenement buildings where voices drifted through open windows, lullabies in Yiddish, arguments in Sicilian, the high laughter of children who didn't yet know the weight of these streets. And he'd think about how, for all the differences in language and blood, the rules underneath were the same. Protect your own. Don't get caught. never betray a trust unless you're ready for what comes next. By the end of that year, Luciano's face was known in more corners than it had been before. Not famous, fame was dangerous in this business, but recognized. He could walk into an Irish room bar and get a nod from the man behind the counter. He could pass a group of Jewish boys playing dice and hear his name spoken without contempt. It wasn't power yet, but it was something that could grow into power. And Luciano, even as a teenager, was already thinking in terms of what could be built, not just what could be taken. There was a moment, late one night, when he stood on the corner of Delancey and Orchard, watching the city lights ripple in the windows of the elevated train. The air was cold enough to sting his lungs. Somewhere down the block, music spilled out of a dance hall, a tinny piano, the muffled stomp of feet. He thought about Palermo, about the smell of the sea, the sun-baked walls, the voices of men speaking in that low, deliberate way Sicilians did when they were saying something without saying it. And he realized that, here in New York, the language was different, but the game was the same. The streets were just another version of the old country, and if you learned their grammar, you could write your own future. It would be years before anyone called him lucky. But the foundation was being laid here, in the smoke of in the shuffle of cards, in the unremarkable errands that were never truly unremarkable. Every coin he earned, every nod of recognition, every whispered invitation to step into a darker room was another brick in the road he was building. And somewhere, in the quiet spaces between these small jobs, he began to imagine where that road might lead. It began without a headline. It arrived like a temperature drop, only the attentive notice, conversations clipped, eyes holding a fraction too long, footsteps pausing at doors they used to pass. By the winter of 1929, the city's underworld had hardened into a chessboard. Every corner a square, every square a wager. The Castellammarese war did not thunder. It breathed, low and constant, until men forgot the texture of ordinary days. Charlie Luciano, already lucky to some, understood that this was not really a war of guns. Bullets were punctuation. The sentences were composed elsewhere. The back of a restaurant, a hallway with 2 chairs, a kitchen where coffee cooled while no one drank. He had learned patience in hallways and fire escapes, learned to read a room the way a card sharp reads the deck. Now patience would be the sharpest tool he dared to hold in the open, to older worlds, pressed against each other beneath the electric light of a new city. On one side, Joe, the boss, Masseria, thick with certainty, tethered to the weight of habit. He could command a room by refusing to move. On the other, Salvatore Maranzano, the Castellammares who loved rank and ritual, speaking of order like a priest reciting liturgy. Between them lay the city's money bootlegging, gambling, protection leaking value by the hour. Luciano wore the role of loyal lieutenant to Masseria because roles protect a man while he thinks. But at night, when the elevated lines moaned and the river narrowed to a seam of metal, he counted the cost. Storefronts bordered, cars that never finished their routes, empty chairs at kitchen tables. A city can grind its teeth for only so long before it breaks something essential. He remembered the Lower East Side, not as sentiment, but as instruction. Boys trading marbles, elders trading wisdom, money trading hands. Streets, he knew, could be arguments, and arguments ended only when the unacceptable became ordinary. If the war continued, the unacceptable would ossify into law. He met with Myelansky in a back room that could have been anywhere. Thin tablecloth, thick door, 2 cups that stayed full. Lansky spoke with a bookkeeper's impatience for waste. Benjamin Siegel moved like a draft, restless and still in the same breath. They agreed on first principles. Profit has no accent. Stability needs no banner. The wall between ethnic crews did not guard honor. It strangled business. End the war and the river of money would run clear again. The afternoon with the clams arrives in memory as if wrapped in gauze, sunlight on white linen. A slow breeze at the window, Masseria smiling with a tired man's courtesy. By then, Luciano had chosen choice in his world, looked like not flinching. The men who entered were efficient. Afterward, the room held a hush that felt like accuracy. Luciano stepped into the street with the light behind him and felt the old order sliding off like a heavy coat. Power does not introduce itself. It tests how you carry it. For a few weightless days after Masseria's death, the city walked carefully around Luciano as if the air had changed, but no one dared name the weather. Then Maranzano gathered the threads and crowned himself Capo di Tutti Capi, boss of all bosses, piecing authority from ceremony and fear. He loved maps, charts, the Roman music of ranks. He wanted families, territories, rules etched into thresholds like height marks. Luciano observed, agreed where agreement cost nothing, and learned the shape of the room he might soon be forced to occupy. He respected structure, chaos starved. Business, but he saw brittleness in Maranzano's devotion to hierarchy, a confusion of memory with method. The city was faster than any crown. Alliances with Jewish crews, with Irish muscle, with quiet men who preferred ledgers to legends, those were the veins of tomorrow's revenue. Under a monarch, veins clot. A rumor arrived dressed as advice. Maranzano had started measuring Luciano with a ruler not his own. Invitations carried compliments that felt like forms to be signed. In that season, praise was a net and questions were a searchlight. Luciano had been poor in many ways, but not in self-possession. He would not let another man weigh his future. He arranged a different ending. September, late summer, still in the air. Men entered Maranzano's office dressed as tax agents, their authority stitched into their sleeves. The meeting they conducted lasted the length of a ledger line. When they left, a chapter closed like a cash drawer. Outside, the city's noise continued at the old volume, indifferent to the page turning. Silence did not feel empty. It felt like room. Into that room, Luciano carried a design he trusted. He refused the crown and proposed a table, the commission. The strongest families would sit as peers, each with a vote, each responsible for profit and peace. Disputes would be arbitrated, not avenged. Territory would be a map, not a battlefield. The new code was practical. Fewer funerals, steadier dividends. The city, accustomed to storms, considered a season of weather that could be predicted. He met men who had been enemies and found them ready for arithmetic. Bootlegging lines were rationalized. Percentages were agreed. Gambling was divided cleanly. Unions were approached as partners rather than prey, their stability underwriting revenue. In private, he threaded old pride through new cloth, telling traditionalists the commission protected dignity, telling modernists it protected margins. Both were true. He had learned on the Lower East Side to speak two languages at once. The first commission meeting offered no anthem. It offered cigarettes, ashtrays, murmurs, and a few laughs that sounded like men remembering they were alive. Their agreements were not ink on paper. They were future weekends without funerals, cash counted without trembling, children asleep while fathers returned intact. In those modest ambitions, the underworld felt, briefly, almost domestic. Some men would never forgive the way the war ended. They wore mourning like a uniform. Luciano let them keep it, knowing grief is a currency with its own exchange rate. He did not ask for affection, he asked for order. Where order held, he let memory stand. Where it threatened business, he applied persuasion that felt like gravity. The newspapers, denied a crown to photograph, tried to picture the architecture. They sensed anew, quiet, and wrote around it, invoking civility as if civility were not sometimes the most efficient form of control. The public felt fewer tremors. Bottles moved, bets cleared, wages were collected with less ceremony, and yet the shadows persisted, useful to those who understood them, dangerous to those who mistook them for emptiness. Late one evening, window opened to a seam of river air. Luciano stood still and let the city blur. No enemies in the room, no allies either. Just the soft music of traffic, the ordinary fullness of a place that had decided, once again, to continue. The war had ended with arithmetic. Peace, he knew, would require daily math. He turned off the lamp, and the room became a mirror. Somewhere below, laughter rose and fell. Somewhere across town, fresh understandings began. The commission would hold until it didn't. The table was the best invention he had, not a cure, but a method. He accepted the compromise because he believed in mornings. And in the soft, exacting dark, he shaped the vow that would guide him. Keep the city quiet enough for business to breathe, and never mistake quiet for safety. The year was 1931, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, New York's criminal underworld exhaled. The Castilla Marie's war, that slow, grinding conflict that had soaked the city in quiet dread, was over. But for Lucky Luciano, the silence that followed wasn't peace. It was opportunity. He moved through the days with a new kind of authority, one earned not by bluster or the spilling of unnecessary blood, but by endurance, patience, and an uncanny ability to navigate the spaces between loyalty and betrayal. The city's underworld was fractured, scattered like shards of glass after a long fight. Some men still nursed grudges from the war, others were eager to fill the power vacuum. Luciano, however, didn't see chaos as a threat. He saw it as raw material. In the late summer of that year, a discreet meeting took place in a private suite overlooking Manhattan. The curtains were drawn tight, the windows shut against the hum of the streets below. Cigarette smoke curled lazily in the lamplight, blurring the sharp edges of the men who sat around a polished mahogany table. Luciano's presence was calm, almost understated. He didn't dominate the room with raised voice or theatrical gestures. Instead, he spoke slowly, with pauses that allowed every word to sink in. Around him sat the men who, collectively, controlled the city's rackets, each one dangerous in his own way, each one more accustomed to dictating terms than listening to them. But Luciano had a vision, and visions, he knew, required patience. He began speaking of the war not in terms of winners or losers, but in terms of its futility. How much money had been lost, how many good earners had been buried because of pride, how many business opportunities had slipped away while the streets ran red. His language was deliberate, less the fiery rhetoric of a wartime boss, and more the measured reasoning of a businessman. He didn't say we must change. He said if we want to survive, we have no choice. Luciano's plan was radical in its simplicity, Abolish the old structure of a single boss of bosses who ruled over all others. Instead, replace it with a council, a commission where each major family would have a seat, their interests represented, their disputes settled without the need for endless bloodshed. In the room, there were skeptical glances. Old world bosses, steeped in Sicilian tradition, viewed such a structure as dangerous. It diluted personal authority. It invited outsiders into decisions once made behind closed doors by a single figure. But Luciano anticipated this resistance. He laid out the logic like a chess master explaining a winning strategy. Territories would be divided to avoid overlap. Profits would be protected by mutual agreement. If disagreements arose, they would be discussed and voted upon. The commission would function like a board of directors, an American solution to an Italian problem. The more he spoke, the more even the most reluctant men began to picture the possibilities. Less risk, more stability, and the ability to focus on making money rather than waging war. Beneath Luciano's calm explanation, there was something unspoken. He knew this system would bind the families together in a web of mutual interest. It wouldn't eliminate conflict. Nothing could, but it would make war costly and unattractive. And in such a structure, the man who could mediate, persuade, and hold the balance, that man would wield the real power. Luciano didn't need to be the visible capo di tutti capi. He would be the quiet architect, the man everyone came to when something had to be resolved. He understood that the kind of power you don't advertise is the kind that lasts the longest. In the months that followed, Luciano became less a boss and more a diplomat. Meetings were constant in back rooms of restaurants, in smoke-filled hotel suites, in the corner booths of dimly lit clubs. He learned to read the smallest shifts in body language, the way a man's hand lingered on his glass before answering a question, the tightening of a jaw when a certain name was mentioned. He spoke to each faction in their own language. To the old Sicilians, he framed the commission as an evolution of honor, a way to preserve tradition without succumbing to self-destruction. To the younger American-born mobsters, he spoke in the language of profit, efficiency, and opportunity. Every handshake, every quiet nod was part of the architecture. Brick by brick, he built the structure in the minds of the men who would make it real. What made Luciano's approach extraordinary was not just the scale of his ambition, but the discipline with which he executed it. He avoided unnecessary killings, understanding that every death created ripples, widows who whispered, soldiers who wondered if they'd be next, businesses that lost their operators when disputes arose. Luciano resisted the easy temptation to make an example. Instead, he mediated, often finding a compromise that allowed both sides to walk away with something. This was not weakness, it was control. The man who could end a conflict without firing a shot commanded more respect than the one who could only solve problems with bullets. One evening, long after most of the city had gone to sleep, Luciano stood at the window of his apartment, looking out at the grid of lights stretching across Manhattan. The city had changed since he first set foot here as a boy. Back then, power was loud, messy, constantly on the move. Now, under his influence, it was becoming quiet, deliberate, organized. He thought of the commission not just as a tool for survival, but as a legacy, something that could outlast any single man. Yet even as the idea took shape, he knew that truth, in this world, permanence was an illusion. Power, no matter how carefully constructed, could always be undone by time, ambition, or betrayal. By the winter of 1931, The commission was real. The first official meeting took place in a private dining room in Midtown. The table was set with crisp linens, the hum of conversation subdued beneath the clink of glasses. Representatives from each major family were present. Some smiled icily. Others sat in watchful silence. Luciano presided not as a king, but as a chairman. The agenda was simple: confirm territories, discuss profit-sharing agreements, and establish procedures for resolving disputes. No one raised their voice. No one reached for a weapon. The air was tense, but it was a tension born of calculation, not chaos. For the first time, the underworld was operating under rules they had written themselves. As the evening drew to a close, and the men began to leave, Luciano lingered at the table, his hand resting on the back of the chair he had occupied all night. It wasn't a throne, but it might as well have been. He knew that as long as he could hold this seat, not physically, but in influence, the system he had built would stand. But he also knew something else, something he would never voice aloud. Every system contains the seeds of its own undoing. All he could do was tend to it, protect it, and hope that when the time came, it would fall in a way that didn't take him with it. Luciano left that night without fanfare, stepping into the cold air with the quiet satisfaction of a man who had just redrawn the map of an entire world, and the knowledge that, for now, it was his world to guide. The mid-1930s were not an age for complacency. Even in the glow of power, there were shadows, longer, darker, and more deliberate than the light they followed. Lucky Luciano's empire stood at its peak. The commission, his invention, hummed with the precision of a machine. Territories were respected. Disputes were settled with meetings instead of bullets. Money flowed like an unbroken current from the street corners to the gambling rooms, to the docks, and finally to the pockets of those wise enough to stay loyal. But the higher the structure, the more it attracted the gaze of those who wished to see it toppled. District Attorney Thomas E. Dewey was unlike the street-level adversaries Luciano had learned to outthink. Dewey didn't carry a gun, didn't need muscle behind him. His weapons were indictments, subpoenas, and a relentless public image of where other prosecutors could be bent, bribed, or intimidated. Dewey seemed to move through such attempts untouched. Luciano had heard whispers of the man before. They said Dewey was ambitious. They said he was building his career by targeting vice and organized crime. But whispers were easy to dismiss. Luciano had faced ambition before and lived to tell the tale. It was not until early 1936 that he realized this was different. The city felt different that winter. There was no open war in the streets, but in back rooms, conversations grew tense. Meetings were quieter. Men who once met Luciano's eyes now glanced away too quickly. The air seemed to carry an unspoken warning. Someone was building a case, brick by brick, paper by paper. Luciano did not pace or shout. That wasn't his way. Instead, he read the newspapers with more care, noting each small headline about raids on brothels, arrests of madams, and whispered testimony about a power behind the scenes. He understood the message. Dewey was pulling at the threads, and somewhere along the line they would lead to him. It happened in April 1936. The details were plain on paper: compulsory prostitution charges, accusations that Luciano orchestrated a vast network of brothels. But the moment itself was heavier than any headline could convey. The knock on the door wasn't frantic. It was measured, the kind of knock that announced inevitability. Luciano opened it himself, flanked by a few of his closest men. There was no shouting, no drawn guns. Just Dewey's men with the calm authority of people who knew they had the upper hand. Luciano didn't argue. He didn't protest. He put on his coat, buttoned it slowly, and walked out into the cool morning air. He had always believed in controlling the narrative, even in defeat. The jail was no place for illusions. The cell door closed with a metallic finality, the sound echoing off concrete that smelled of damp and rust. The cot was narrow, the mattress thin enough to feel every steel bar beneath. In the early days, visitors came, lawyers, associates, even a few allies who wanted to reassure him that the commission would keep running smoothly. But as the weeks passed, the faces became fewer. The business of the underworld did not pause for sentiment. Nights were the worst. The city outside kept moving. He could almost hear it in the hum beyond the barred window. But here, time slowed. Minutes stretched into hours. He thought of the commission meetings, the quiet authority he once commanded, the way decisions shaped lives across boroughs. Now, decisions were made without him, and he could not know if his influence would last. The newspapers wanted drama. They wanted fireworks in the courtroom, shouting matches, surprise witnesses, dramatic revelations. But Luciano's trial was not a stage play. It was slow, methodical, and suffocatingly inevitable. Witnesses took the stand, their words stacking like stones in a wall that was closing in. Dewey's strategy was clinical. No grand accusations without proof, no wasted gestures. Each piece of testimony linked to the next until a pattern emerged. The image of Luciano as the architect behind a sprawling vice empire. Luciano listened, rarely reacting. Outwardly, he seemed carved from stone. Inwardly, he weighed every word, every angle. He had built his career on control, but here, in this room, control was slipping away with each passing day in the cell. Between court sessions, he began to feel the full weight of leadership's loneliness. It wasn't simply that he was apart. From his men, it was the realization that his survival no longer depended on street smarts alone. It depended on the shifting loyalties of those outside, on whether the structure he built could survive without its architect. Sometimes he lay, awake, staring at the ceiling, remembering the meetings in dimly lit rooms where deals were struck and rivalries cooled. Those rooms felt impossibly far away now. Leadership had always meant making decisions that others could not. But here, decisions were made for him: when to eat, when to sleep, when to stand in court, when to return to his cell. In June 1936, the jury returned its verdict: guilty. Luciano was sentenced to 30 to 50 years in prison. The courtroom was silent in that moment. No gasp, no outcry, just the scrape of chairs and the shuffling of papers. Luciano stood, straightened his tie, and nodded slightly, to himself more, then to anyone else. The walk back to his cell felt longer than it was. The hallway smelled faintly of disinfectant, the light falling in narrow strips through barred windows. Each step was measured, deliberate. He was no longer the untouchable figure of New York's underworld. He was an inmate, a number in the system. He had once influenced from the outside. From behind the walls, Luciano tried to keep informed. Letters came through intermediaries, coded and careful. The commission still operated, but he could sense the subtle shifts. Some decisions took longer. Some disputes grew hotter before they were resolved. Power, he knew, was like water. It needed constant movement, or it would stagnate. Without his direct influence, the flow was changing. He could do little but watch from a distance, hoping. The structure he built was strong enough to survive the absence of its creator. Prison life settled into a rhythm. Morning roll call, meals that tasted of little, work assignments that passed the hours, and always the night's long unbroken stretches where thought moved slowly, circling the same truths. He had risen faster than most, reshaped the Mafia into something modern, efficient, and enduring. But he had also learned that no structure, no matter how brilliant, was immune to pressure from the outside. In the silence, he understood what he had always known but rarely admitted. Power was never permanent. It was borrowed, not owned. And one day, no matter how carefully you played, the game, the pieces would be taken from the board. For Luciano, that day had come. And now, all he could do was wait and see what remained when the game continued without him. Under the warm, honeyed light of a late Neapolitan afternoon, Lucky Luciano would sometimes sit alone at a small cafe table, the chipped porcelain cup of espresso cooling in his hand. The sound of the waves rolled in from the nearby harbor, a steady, unhurried rhythm that seemed to match the pace of his exile. He had been away from America for years now, banished from the empire he had once commanded with the precision of a chess master. Yet here in Italy, time moved differently. The days stretched long, and memories became companions. The cafes were always the same, cigarette smoke hanging like a veil, the faint clink of glassware, the murmur of conversation in dialects thick and musical. Luciano would watch the locals play cards, their laughter erupting in bursts, their arguments dissolving just as quickly. He was a man used to controlling the table, deciding the stakes, and dictating the terms. Now, the game belonged to others, and yet he knew in a quiet, unspoken way that the rules they followed were the ones he had written decades before. From the moment he had been deported after the war, he had understood there would be no return. The United States had made its position clear. His release from prison had been negotiated as part of a wartime deal, his contacts and influence used to secure American interests in Sicily during the Allied invasion. But the price was permanent exile. He had traded the streets of New York for the sun-drenched coasts of Naples. Some afternoons, the nostalgia would creep in uninvited. He would remember the hum of New York traffic in the 1920s, the glow of street lamps. On wet pavement, the scent of roasted chestnuts from corner vendors. He thought of the meetings in dim back rooms, the feel of heavy envelopes slid across tables, the quiet nods that sealed million-dollar decisions. In those moments, he would lean back, letting the taste of the espresso linger as if it might somehow bring the city closer. His old allies visited from time to time, men he had once trusted with territories, shipments, and decisions that could mean life or death. They would arrive with tailored suits and practiced smiles, carrying with them whispers. From across the Atlantic, they spoke of shifting alliances, of younger, hungrier men rising through the ranks. Luciano would listen without interruption, his eyes giving nothing away. He understood the unspoken truth. His empire lived on, but it was no longer his to command. There was no bitterness in him, or at least none he allowed to surface. Power, he had learned, was never permanent. It was a current that moved with the tides, and his tide had already reached its high point. What remained was the satisfaction that the structure he had built, the commission, the system of balance, an order was still standing. It was the architecture of his mind, now inhabited by others. The streets of Naples became his quiet domain. He walked them at odd hours, his fedora angled just enough to shadow his face. People recognized him, of course. His reputation had crossed oceans. Some offered a polite nod, others a wary glance. To them, he was both a relic and a legend. A man who had lived in the pages of crime and power, yet sat now among them, unarmed and unthreatening. Evenings were often spent on balconies, the salt air drifting in from the bay, the city lights flickering like embers against the dark hills. He would light a cigarette, watching its glow brighten and fade with each breath. In those moments, the past felt both near and impossibly distant. The roar of old engines, the low conversations in smoke-filled rooms, the weight of decisions that had changed the course of men's lives. All of it existed somewhere, just beyond the horizon of his memory. There were rare flashes when his mind would return to the days immediately after his release, the voyage across the Atlantic, the sight of the Italian coastline for the first time in decades. He had stood on the deck of the ship, the sea air sharp against his face, and thought about what awaited him. He knew it would not be the same. He knew he was walking into the long shadow of his own history. But he also knew that even in absence, influence could endure. By the late 1950s, Luciano's life had settled into a rhythm. He was still occasionally consulted, still a figure of reference when disputes arose, though now it was through intermediaries and coded messages. The new generation spoke in different slang, used different tools, but the skeleton of their operations was unmistakably his. One winter evening in 1962, the air at Naples Capodichino Airport was cool, tinged with the faint scent of aviation fuel. Luciano was there for a meeting. Nothing urgent, nothing dangerous, just a discussion with an old contact about a film project rumored to depict parts of his life. He stood near the terminal, his coat collar turned up, a cigarette in hand. Those who were there later said it was sudden. A hand went to his chest, his breath caught, and the cigarette fell from his fingers, its ember snuffed out on the damp ground. There was no grand final scene, no violence, no crowd of enemies. Just a man at the edge of an airport walkway, his heart failing as the world carried on around him. He died as he had lived in exile, without spectacle, without confession. The headlines came quickly, carrying his name across the globe, one final time. For some, he was the ruthless architect of modern organized crime. For others, he was a strategist, a man who understood that order was more powerful than chaos. In Naples, life moved on. The cafes remained filled, the card games continued, the waves still kissed the harbor stones. Somewhere in New York, the commission still met, its members debating territories and disputes according to rules. Drafted by a man now buried in Italian soil, Luciano's story did not end with his death. It simply faded into the larger narrative of the underworld he had shaped. He had been many things: a survivor, a reformer, a criminal, a leader. But above all, he had been a man who understood the fragility of power and the endurance of systems. And so, in the quiet streets of Naples, under balconies where laundry swayed in the breeze, his legacy lingered, not in the form of statues or monuments, but in the unseen architecture of an empire that still operated, decades after the man who built it had gone. The waves kept their rhythm, the city its pace, and somewhere in the murmured conversations of men in shadowed rooms, his name was still spoken, not loudly, not often, but always with the recognition that some blueprints outlast the builders. The city at night has its own language. It speaks in muted hums, the soft growl of distant traffic, the sigh of steam rising from a manhole cover, the rhythmic clink of footsteps on wet pavement. Decades have passed since Charles Lucky Luciano walked these streets, yet his fingerprints remain. Not the kind dusted for in crime labs, but the invisible kind, embedded in habits, codes, and unspoken rules that still govern the city's darker corners. The mafia he left behind is not the same as the one he built. Time has eroded its glamour, replaced tailored suits with tracksuits, and whispered deals in dimly lit restaurants with encrypted messages on disposable phones. Yet, if you peel away, the surface changes. The skeleton beneath is his. The commission, the governing council, Luciano, designed to end bloody turf wars, still operates, though less formally, hidden in the folds of modern life. Decisions are no longer scrawled on paper or passed in whispers in back rooms of Italian cafes. Now they are buried in layers of coded communication, banking shells, and anonymous offshore transfers. The tools have changed. The intent has not. In the dim corners of Queens, Staten Island, and Brooklyn, men still meet in the early hours. Their names are different, their accents more varied, but their hierarchy follows Luciano's blueprint. A boss, an underboss, a consiglia, capos, and soldiers. Orders are filtered downward, loyalty flows upward, and silence omerta remains the unbreakable rule. Luciano understood something fundamental about power. It thrives in the spaces people overlook. A well-dressed man sipping espresso on a street corner attracts less suspicion than a man hiding in shadows. Today, the street corner has become a yacht deck in Monaco, a sushi bar in Tokyo, or the executive lounge of an airport. The stage changes, but the script is familiar. Beyond the Italian-American Mafia, Luciano's model spread like ink in water. Cartels in Latin America, triads in Hong Kong, Bratva in Moscow, each absorbed fragments of his vision, structure, discipline, diversification. Even cybercrime rings follow similar patterns, with administrators, coders, and money launderers arranged in a chain of command that would make a 1930s mob boss nod in approval. In some ways, Luciano's exile to Italy was the beginning of his myth. Distance wrapped him in legend, allowing others to project their own stories onto his name. His influence grew not from direct control, but from the resilience of the system he built. A structure like his, once rooted, doesn't need its architect, and yet the streets remember. Walk through lower Manhattan after midnight, and you'll still find pockets where time feels slippery. A bakery that's been open since 1929, its counters wiped clean by hands that once served soldiers in the old regime. A park bench where an old man smokes a cigar slowly, like each puff is a memory. A quiet corner booth in an aging Italian restaurant, the kind where the lights are low and the air smells faintly of garlic and wine, and where conversations lower to a murmur when a certain kind of man walks in. These are the living embers of Luciano's fire. They burn low, but they burn steady. If Luciano were here now, he might marvel at the reach of his legacy, or perhaps he would find it inevitable. The internet has replaced the back alley. Cryptocurrencies have replaced cash-filled envelopes. But the fundamental human impulse for organized power, the desire to create order in the chaos of crime, remains unchanged. He would recognize the faces, not by name, but by posture. The way a man leans in to speak softly, the way eyes scan a room before sitting, the subtle nods that confirm an unspoken agreement. And just as in his day, the system survives not by brute force alone, but by adaptation. Violence is now a whisper, not a shout, targeted, invisible, designed to disappear into the static of everyday life. Luciano would understand this perfectly. He was, after all, the one who taught them to step back from the street corner, to move the chess pieces quietly. But for all his pragmatism, there's an undeniable romance in the old ways. The slow dance of trust and betrayal, the ritual of respect, the strange blend of fear and admiration. Today's world moves faster, trades quicker, forgets sooner. The modern underworld is efficient, but perhaps less human. As dawn approaches, the city begins to stir. Delivery trucks hiss to a stop, cafes unlock their doors, and the wet streets start to dry. The shadows retreat, but they never vanish completely. They cling to the undersides of bridges, to the narrow alleys between apartment blocks, to the silent apartments where blinds stay drawn until noon. The rain-slicked streets of our beginning return, empty now, but heavy with memory. In the faint reflection of a street lamp on the pavement, you can almost see him, a figure in a long coat, hat tilted low, moving with the quiet confidence of a man who knows every turn before he makes it. He is not really there, of course. Luciano has been gone for decades, but the idea of him, the architecture of his power, still walks beside us. And maybe that is the truest form of legacy. Not a name carved in stone, not a statue in a public square, but a pattern woven so tightly into the fabric of life that removing it would unravel everything around it. Some say the modern mafia is a shadow of its former self. Others argue it has simply evolved beyond recognition. Both may be right. What is certain is that the bones of its design are Luciano's, and those bones will likely outlast another generation. The final echo is not the roar of an empire at its height, but the soft, steady sound of footsteps fading into the city's heartbeat, a reminder that power, once born, rarely dies, it only changes shape. And so the story closes where it began, in the quiet, in the rain, in a city that never truly sleeps. The lights may have shifted, the players may have changed, but somewhere, in the hum between streetlights, the shadow of Lucky Luciano still moves.